I think there's a fundamental dynamic whereby society has become increasingly segregated. Public life is very segmented, and you find a situation where people don't talk to people who are not like themselves. I think that's particularly the case with the political class. I think the political class has become so estranged from the dynamic of everyday life that it continually projects its own concerns on it and fails to realize that people think very differently. And I remember the day after Brexit talking to my member of parliament, and then talking to people on the streets, and it was like talking to two different nationalities. The concerns were totally different. And I think the sad thing is that sense of polarization, of social distancing, has, if anything, become far more pervasive today than it was 2 years ago.
Yes, I agree with that, but I would add that, in my view, there's a new division in Western societies, not just in British society, that has, you can say, replaced the old division between the classes, and it's a division more in terms of, that can be understood in terms of lifestyles, that reflects two different conceptions of the nation, a closed one and an open one. And it does correspond very much with education and more cosmopolitanized or internationalized lifestyles. And that's it's been quite clearly reflected in the voting pattern. Broadly speaking, young and educated people voting Remain, and less educated or less university educated people voting Leave. I think that's slightly complicated the old class divisions.
Perhaps the other thing to say is that the government was divided, and that the Remain campaign particularly was very, very feeble, in the sense that nobody was really talking about the positive things about the European Union. They were just saying it's not as bad as some people think.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up a point of Gerald was saying, I don't think that it was the case that there was one side that's open to the world and one that was closed. And when you look at the literature and the rhetoric of both sides, they were both totally closed in terms of their capacity to enter into dialogue. I mean, was very strange that real debate, substantive debate, where people were engaging each other's ideas, was conspicuous by its absence. And I find that the university educated, the intelligentsia, are no less prejudiced than their political opponents, even though they tend to have this fantasy that all the ethnocentrism, all the prejudice is on one side, whereas there is very enlightened individuals who have transcended, the national boundaries and are open to every possibility. When you scratch the surface, I think you'll find that we do suffer from closed-mindedness all around, and people can see closed-mindedness in relation to their opponents, but not when it comes to their own camp.
But I would say, though, that the Remain campaign particularly was limiting itself by not wanting to say anything positive, and hoping that it was kind of reaching out to people by saying it's not so bad.
Yeah, I can accept that on the level of political discourse and the different positions, but in terms of the actual people who voted, I think one can find a more open conception of citizenship, of political community among those who voted Remain than was the case of those who voted Leave. So I would draw that distinction, and I would also add that European integration has been, over the past 40 years or whatever, been normalized. It's been sort of taken for granted. So that led to a situation in which there were not many arguments to be given for something that had become basically taken for granted. So the Leave campaign had an easy task to make an argument to leave, because this was innovation as opposed to what had become normalized. I think that with a feature, a characteristic of the Leave vote, the sense of a break, something new, as opposed to something that has become normal.
And yet you could argue that the European Union has been looking for arguments to legitimate itself for over 2 or 3 decades. And therefore, it was precisely an opportunity, if you were genuinely for the European Union, to find some positive arguments. But I think that the failure to project that, was surprising given what happened in the past.
Yeah, well, I'm not entirely in agreement with that. I mean, of course, there was a failure to articulate arguments in favour of Europe, but that, in a way, was because precisely of the success of the European project, that it had achieved many of its earlier objectives, like the objective of peace, for example. It's now unimaginable that there would be war in Europe, and that was something that was important for several decades. So Europe achieved many of its earlier aims, a victim of its success, I would say.
Well, I mean, right across Europe, a European identity gets much less strong support than a national identity. So there's nothing particular about Britain in that respect. What has happened, I think, in Britain is that people are identifying with the European Union in a way that they didn't before, and these kind of badges saying, "I love EU," that this was unthinkable in the past, and that's really transformed attitudes.
Yeah, my perspective on this is maybe a little bit more complicated. I think there is neither. I think Brexit is not an example of British national identity. In fact, I think it's an expression of its impossibility. And I think as regards the form that European identity takes, I've always argued that whilst there are indeed people, I suspect a minority, who kind of identify with Europe and see themselves as European, the most important form that European identity takes is within the form of the nation. So that's to say, you have conceptions of national identity that are themselves Europeanized. The point I'm making is that I don't think there's a European identity and there's a national one, and that they're in some kind of a struggle with each other. I think most national identities today have been Europeanized. And I would literally argue that a national identity as such is now almost impossible because of competing conceptions of what it is. And I think it was very well represented by Brexit.
I think that there are many parts of Europe where national identity has got a degree of traction, for example, in Central and East Europe. But even there, it's not as strong as it's often made out to be. I think that people have often confused what happened with Brexiteers, because they were often been told they're English nationalists and they're really into the identity of the nation. I think that that's a wrong interpretation. Most Brexiteers have a very weak sense of national identity. I think what they're looking for is a kind of solidarity to which they cannot give a name, because that kind of identity at the moment is a very elusive one. I also think that European identity literally does not exist. And in fact, if it exists anywhere, it exists in a kind of performative way among some Remainers in England, who have developed this kind of counter notion to the Brexiteers by waving the European flag and indicating how much they love Europe. And I think it's very interesting. I did a series of interviews with people in my area who are into Europe, and I kind of asked them, well, do you speak a foreign language? What do you know about Europe? What is it about the European legacy that you find attractive? And they're totally ignorant of that. I think for them, embracing the European flag was a way of saying that we're respectable. We're not xenophobic. We're not like the scum that voted for, the deplorables that voted for Brexit. And it was a way of almost kind of finding a way of differentiating themselves from the people who they regarded as morally inferior to them. But it's not really a European identity yet. Talking to people in Brussels, I think what I find very interesting, I've talked to several people involved in the Museum of History there and other places, is that they are desperately concerned about the fact that the legitimation problem of the European Union, which was, if anything, has been exacerbated, seems to have no real solution to it. And I think we have to realize that the European Union relied entirely on its economic success in the past. And given the post-recessionary moment, with that gone, there's very little to kind of give it a kind of positive kind of content. And I think people are looking desperately to find something like that. And I do agree with Gerard that neither identities are going to be very successful in the period ahead as independent identities.
I don't know why you question the idea of nationalism. I mean, it does seem to me that the rhetoric is massively nationalistic among the leavers. I mean, all this talk about treason, there's that motif. There's also the bad loser motif, which, okay, is not nationalistic in itself. I mean, I think Michael Billig's notion of banal nationalism, it's very difficult to generate in the way that the European Union has tried to do, to generate a kind of banal transnationalism with the flag and the anthem and so forth. So it's an uphill slope.
I think one of the successes of Europe as an identity is that it's a kind of a non-identity, that it doesn't have the characteristics of a national identity with strong reference points and things that people strongly identify with. But I wanted to make the point that, as far as Brexit is concerned as a national identity, what national identity is it? Is it English national identity, which I suppose it is, or is it British national identity? And I think in no conceivable way can it be considered to be British, because of course it points to the possible eventual breakup of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. And for the first time, people are talking about a united Ireland as a possibility, at least. But it certainly can't be considered to be a British national identity. And if anything, it's a sort of an English national identity, incorporating both left and right-wing elements of national identity. But I agree that insofar as a European identity is codified by anti-Brexit, it's kind of in the same way locked in a kind of a struggle with levers, that they're both defining each other. But I think that's a rather superficial understanding of European identity. And maybe identity is the wrong word to use.
Somebody was suggested that there should be a kind of No Europe Day where all the borders were closed again and you had to change your money at every border, and that would kind of bring home to people the sense of what they would lose.
Sounds desperate.
Well, I don't think there can be a return to singular nation states because of the tangled nature of states and economies and culture. I think that it's not possible to turn the clock back, as it were. Things will move forward in many different directions. I would also say there's a danger of looking for historical analogies. The one that is the favourite one at the moment is not the period before the First World War, but the period between the two world wars. But I think the current situation can't really be compared to the circumstances of what was, well, essentially a pre-democratic era. And in many ways, Brexit is a product of democracy. It's a product of the failure of democracy. It's a product of an authoritarian turn in democracy. But nonetheless, democracy gave rise to the situation that we're in. That was fundamentally different at the end of the 19th century, when there were hardly any democracies, and those that were can hardly be considered to be democracies in the sense of the term as we use it today. So I think there's maybe one example, the example of how the major powers sleepwalked into the First World War that everyone is talking about, and how easily that can happen. And that's perhaps one historical analogy. But I think the current situation is fundamentally different as a result of several decades of European integration that have led to a situation of basically irreversibility. And I think my personal view is that Brexit is an impossibility. It can't be done. You can't unlock this history.
I think that Brexit is very important. It's got durable legacy, but it's not in terms of creating a new kind of nation or going back to the past. It's got to do with the fact that for the first time in the post-war period, the will of the people was expressed most directly. Then rather than being a failure of democracy, it constitutes a success of democracy. When you talk to people that voted in the referendum, they will tell you that for the first time I realized that my vote actually meant something, because in the past, if you lived in a Tory constituency, no matter how you voted, a Conservative would get elected. If you voted in a Labour constituency, no matter what, a Labour person would get elected. But now, my own vote actually meant something. And a lot of people really feel liberated by that. And I think it's a wonderful sort of demonstration that, given the wisdom of the masses, and I think that people tend to ignore that. They imagine that wisdom is monopolized by the elites, by the ruling classes, by the people in government, and that ordinary people are too stupid to know what's in their best interest. That seems to be the dominant argument that's put forward there. This has really opened things up, and the major legacy of Brexit is that it's indicated to a lot of people that the existing party system is corrupt, it's empty of meaning, it's unraveling in front of their eyes, it's run by self-serving politicians who've got no real stake in the interest of society, who live in a world that's quite separate. And I think that as a result of that, Brexit has created, along with developments in Europe, because this is part of a much wider kind of movement, an entirely new political situation where the post-war order and the regime that were established is actually called into question. And I think that one of the upsides of that for me is, contrary to what Gerard was saying, I think it calls into question the transnational system of governance, the technocratic system of governance, where political decision-making is outsourced to these international unelected bodies and judiciary bodies like the European Court of Human Rights or the IMF or the European Union. And I think that it begins to tell people that actually politics should be about accountability. It shouldn't be sort of outsourced to experts. It shouldn't be outsourced to institutions that are not kind of accountable to us. And I think that is, to me, the durable legacy, which allows people who are oriented towards the future to think about new political ideas and new political solutions for the 21st century.
I think that would be more convincing if the Brexit vote had been 95-5 in favour of leaving. I mean, the will of the people is evenly divided between the people who actually voted.
Would you have said that if the vote was the other way around? If the Remain had won by 52 against 48, would you?
Well, that's a fundamentally different situation. That would be a different situation, because it would be a confirmation of the status quo as opposed to changing the status quo. And that's we can be agreed that there are problems with parliamentary democracy, with the party system as it evolved over the past half century, and there are problems with European governance, absolutely. But what Brexit demonstrates is the absolute danger of referendums as instruments of democracy, at least when they don't concern single-issue questions that have an open and closed answer. But if you put a general question of leave and without specifying what leave might be, that is obviously we're seeing today the consequences of putting to the population such an open-ended question without specifying the rules for determining what might be the majority, where the majority defines the people.
For the incompetence of Parliament? I mean, the people said leave, and they were unambiguous about it. Parliamentarians find it very difficult to make a decision about. I
don't agree. I think that there was great ambiguity about what leave could possibly mean, because it can mean many different things. And moreover, the referendum, which was a consultative one, didn't specify the majority in question, because what's the will of the people? What's the people? It needs to be constitutionally defined. And for such referendums, most countries have a definition of what the people in question that constitutes the majority, or namely approximately around about 2/3, and that wasn't the case. So it led to the disastrous outcome of 1.2 million majority in favour of leave, which means that if 600,000 plus one voted the other way, the result would be the opposite. So that's a very, very slim majority to bring about such a massive reversal of social institutions.
I think the most important thing that should be learned from the referendum is to take it more seriously. I think a lot of people before the referendum imagined that nothing would change. They completely believed their own version of events. They didn't actually talk to people. And therefore they made no effort to politicize or give an intellectual input into the discussion. The referendum discussion was very feeble and lacked real content. It was entirely hijacked by scaremongering, politics of fear on both sides. I think it was very disheartening to listen to some of those kinds of debates. And it meant that at the end of the day, things weren't really clarified. People had to make up their own mind. And a lot of people told me that they actually didn't really believe what they heard on television. That's not why they voted one way or the other. They voted because of their own experience. But it seems to me that the real failure in the referendum campaign was the reluctance by a significant section of society, people who should have known better, to take it a little bit more seriously, because these are very important moments in our political life. They're irreversible, because regardless of what's going to happen, it has changed public life in Britain forever. And I think that's why it's important that we prepare for it, clarify the issues.
We probably agree that the referendum was discredited by outside interference and a whole set of other things. The exclusion of the franchise from younger people who in Scotland would have been able to vote, of the European citizens who were most concerned by what was happening and were excluded from the vote, and the emigrants who'd been moved from this country more than 15 years ago. So I think that referendum, you need to keep the Russians out, keep American money out, and extend the franchise to more young people who, as it happens, are pro-membership of the European Union. But in any case, I think the lowering of the voting age to 16 or maybe below, maybe not quite to 8, as David Runciman has been suggesting, but certainly well below 18 would be extremely beneficial.
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing that should be learned is the relationship between referendums and the wider context of democracy. And there's the current situation is that the referendum is seen as a thing in itself. You've used the word irreversible. I fundamentally disagree with that, because the essence of democracy is reversibility, that one can revisit positions. Referendums are part of the democratic process. This referendum was supposed to be, as I said earlier, consultative. It wasn't something that had to be implemented. And a referendum is part of the democratic process, and there can be many referendums depending on the outcomes. So a referendum shouldn't be simply used as an instrument to resolve a complex and controversial issue to begin with. It's a dangerous instrument unless it's properly defined, like as regards what the majority should be, were it to be a legislative one. In fact, in the history of the UK, there have been only 3 national referendums. There have been other ones, but they've been on specific regional issues. There have been only 3, of which 2 have been significant, and this one, the early one, the referendum on confirming the UK's membership of the European Union, confirmed the status quo, so it didn't actually bring about a fundamental change. There was one in 2011 approximately about changing the voting system that was thrown out, so the status quo wasn't changed. So this was the first national referendum that brought about a change to the status quo, but it was never actually thought through, and it's now been defined as as irreversible as a decision. But the point I'm making is that the process by which collective decisions are made is an extremely complex one. It's not something that's just cut off and then you're left with it forever.
You're missing my point. Irreversibility is not a narrow constitutional issue. Irreversibility basically means that a lot of people, for the first time in their lives, could see that their views about the world was shared by millions of others. The people whose voices were never heard because their voices didn't really matter, could actually see that they weren't just some isolated freaks existing on the margins of society, but they had views that they shared with others. And I think what's irreversible about the referendum is that it let the cat out of the bag. And it indicated that there are views under the surface of society that surprised the very intelligent expert media, that surprised all the political analysts, that surprised the political class, because they just weren't listening to that. And I think that creates an irreversibility. I do think there's a danger of trying to delegitimate, regardless of where you stand, to delegitimate the referendum by saying the result was due to Russian manipulation, it was due to the fact that certain people were excluded from voting and all these things. The people that are arguing this weren't complaining very loudly before the referendum because they had assumed that this would be just a walkover. They weren't really complaining about all these different things about why this really wasn't a legitimate kind of referendum. And I think it's slightly tendentious and self-seeking to then, after the event, say, that if we had 8-year-olds or 16-year-olds voting, it might have been, of course, it might have been a different result, but that's the fantasy way of regarding politics. And it seems to me it also it's a very kind of morally wrong way of looking at things, because it basically says that the voting pattern that occurred before before the Brexit was somehow illegitimate. And I just think that if we adopt that approach, then every time there's a result about anything, we're going to find very good excuses as to why it's not a legitimate outcome.
I accept much of that, but I'm not saying, at least, that the Leave vote was illegitimate. It was what it was, and because of the contested nature of the outcome and the fact that it was a very close outcome of 3.8%, which in numbers is a very, very small number, 1.2 million, that the democratic process should take its course and not simply be closed as it was when Theresa May became Prime Minister, as a decision that had to be implemented. That's what I think needs to be learned.
The irreversibility, of course, is that although you can leave the European Union and then apply to rejoin, it's an extremely cumbersome process, and nobody in their right mind would want to go through that process. So to that extent, the decision taken by the referendum we've had, or by perhaps a second one, will be, a decision to leave would be irreversible for the foreseeable future.
Yes, well, if Brexit goes ahead, and the question, of course, will be in what form will it go ahead? But let's just assume that in some shape or form Brexit goes ahead. I think there's no doubt that the United Kingdom will become a much diminished country in many senses of the term. Also, quite probably, in terms of size, there will be immediately the question of the relationship between Scotland and England, and the question of Northern Ireland. And I mean, Brexit, as I said earlier, Brexit is an expression of English nationalism, and I think that's going to be one major transformation. A smaller UK that might in fact disintegrate, and there will be the complications with Ireland, because I mean a feature of Europe more generally, of the European Union, is that there are many small countries, but they are conscious of the fact that they are small countries, whereas the feature of Britain is it's geographically a relatively small country, but one with a gigantic ego, and Brexit in many ways is it's not a very original point to make, nostalgia for a time of greatness when Britain was important. And I think the first lesson that will be learned is that England, in fact, at the end, is not important.
Yeah, that delusional character of the English-British attitude, I think, has become stronger and stronger ever since the referendum result was known. I mean, the whole notion that 1 to 27 is a sort of, that you're equal opponents, the treating of the European Union as the enemy, even by Hammond, of all people. That, I mean, it seems to me that the UK would not be able to retain any kind of coherence, not just the breakup, which in a sense would be the smallest of the consequences. You can imagine an independent England as a viable entity, but the fact is we now hate each other. We're divided 50-50, irreconcilably. I don't foresee any kind of outcome which is not utterly disastrous.
Well, I can see a lot of positives. I don't accept this dystopic view of the future of England. That everything's going to disintegrate, the economy is going to collapse, and we'll turn into this nostalgic, backward-looking nation of xenophobes, which is the caricature that's often presented. It seems to me that it's the first point to realize that whatever happens in England, the whole global system, the whole globalist framework is falling apart in any case, for a variety of reasons. That regime that was created in the post-war era and then supported in the post-Cold War era is really very weak and very, very feeble. I think that there are new ways of nations engaging with one another, which we need to experiment with. And I think that that's something that is being recognized by people all over the world, not just simply in England. I think Brexit is a peculiarly British expression of that. And it seems to me that one of the things that Brexit can do, and has potential, great potential, which is totally underestimated, is that it can revitalize public life in Britain. It can create a much more dynamic, democratic public sphere than exists in many other parts of Europe and elsewhere. I think that there's nothing wrong with arguing as long as we try to also have dialogue and not just simply stay in our polarized kind of silos. And it seems to me that the idea that somehow England is this pathetic little country that exudes hatred is really a fantasy by people who don't look at reality. I think most English people on either sides are actually quite generous, they're quite tolerant compared to other societies that I lived in. I don't see the kind of xenophobic sort of images and caricatures that are put forward. There are obviously individuals who voice those kinds of views. And you have to remember that England, for all its sins, was a very successful country before Brexit. It wasn't like a pathetic little nation. It had certain potential and capacity. People often make warnings about how these things are going to change. Universities are going to disappear because no international student will want to come to an English university. Well, think of what the higher education was like before Brexit and before the European Union. That's not going to change. I think people will be coming to Britain. I think we are a very globally oriented international nation that's open to yielding to new experience. And I think that's what will come out of Brexit. So I'm very optimistic, if Brexit does happen, that it's going to qualitatively improve the quality of our public life.
Well, yes, I don't think one should reduce Brexit to the dispositions of people and describe them in negative terms. I see Brexit as a political project by the right-wing element of the Conservative Party, and of course it has some resonances in the Labour Party, the socialist edge of the Labour Party, and there's a kind of common purpose there, but it's primarily a right-wing neoliberal project, and one should not forget neoliberal. One should not
what's
forget.
remain if not neoliberal? I mean,
Well,
that's the
Brexit is not one thing; it's many things.
Yeah.
And one dimension of it that's quite clearly behind the 60 or so Tory MPs who are holding the government to hostage is a neoliberal vision of Britain as some kind of a European version of Singapore, a global trading nation. There's quite clearly a strong neoliberal drive behind the Brexit project. It's a political project, and the unexpected result of the referendum gave to them the perfect opportunity to launch this campaign. And of course, it has resonances in the population, all kinds of cultural orientations revolve around it, and as that it has resonances in the radical socialist tradition in the Labour Party, represented by Corbyn, but it's primarily a neoliberal project.
There's strong opposition to globalisation, but I think also a recognition, or there should be a recognition, that any attempts to control the effects of globalisation can only be coordinated on a much larger than a national scale.
But you can't have it both ways. It can be both neoliberal and nationalistic. I think neoliberalism is defined by its attempt to transcend the national border and invest its kind of politics and its resources in transnational cosmopolitan institutions. That's been the record so far.
But I mean, they manage that somehow. I mean, Farage or somebody like that is precisely both neoliberal and nationalistic.
I think in my book what I try to argue is that ideas about the nation and nationalism are context specific. And what I argue in the book is that nationalism in its classical sense is relatively a weak phenomenon in Britain and other European nations. What I argue is that in general what we tend to do is to conflate what we call nationalism with national sensibilities, with patriotism, so that therefore any kind of attachment to the nation is often seen immediately as really the 21st century version of the impulses that led to Weimar Germany becoming Nazi. And I think that what is really going on today, the kind of sentiment that has emerged, is a reaction to what I would call the denationalization of public life, where any kind of national sentiments are seen as, by definition, unacceptable. And it's interesting that in the European context, where we celebrate identities and we talk about diversity, where we talk about how nice it is to have gay identity or lesbian identity or certain forms of ethnic identities, the one identity that is pathologized is that of national identity. And national identity is almost seen as a marker for some kind of xenophobic right-wing kind of sentiment. So I think that what has increased in Europe, not just in Britain, has been a reaction to this attempt to denationalize public life. It's what Habermas argued in terms of his kind of argument is that we somehow got to create a public life which is based on this kind of constitutional patriotism, where any kind of nationalist sensibilities or pre-political links and attachments are eroded. And it seems to me that that reaction has strengthened. But in terms of nationalism, I see very little bit in Britain. I don't think that Brexit has strengthened that. It's important not to confuse the remarks of certain politicians who want to wave the flag with the fact that most ordinary supporters of leaving, aren't classically nationalistic and wouldn't really know what that meant for them. I think they have a very different kind of aspiration regarding the world. And I do think that the issue of nationalism is important insofar as at the moment it is used as a kind of pathologizing medium to kind of mark all kinds of sentiments that are in any sense national linked as being ipso facto bad. So that's what I argue in the book on populism as being the interesting development. And I also suggest that whether we like it or not, in the current era we do need to have space for people to be able to express their national sensibilities, and that there's nothing inherently wrong with feeling a sense of pride about your community. And for most people, it is that kind of link that gives meaning to their lives.
Yeah, well, I agree with much of that. I think one needs to distinguish between an inclusive and an exclusive conception of the nation. Now, when we use the word nationalism, that tends to have negative associations, mostly signifying an exclusive conception of the nation as something that excludes people. However, the notion of the nation does have an inclusive sense, and I think that is a sense of nationalism that needs to be affirmed. Of course, it goes back to the original Republican notion of nationalism, and I would say that's something that's missing from, shall we say, the notion of a European identity. And to reiterate a point I've made earlier, one shouldn't see a European identity as necessarily, by definition, at odds with a national identity. We'll give an example, or many examples. I think Ireland and Germany are two examples of countries, let's just take Ireland for reasons of simplicity, that have now, perhaps in the last 20 years, evolved what we could call a post-national identity, not a national identity that's a non-national identity, but one that incorporates the cosmopolitan or the European dimension. But I think that is a form of national identity, whereas we see with England today, England in the specific sense of Brexit as an expression of English nationalism, that's quite obviously, in my view, an exclusive conception of the nation.
Yeah, the English flag is being displayed much, much more now than in the past. And people defining themselves as English rather than British when they're given that choice.
Because British had an inclusive dimension.
Yes, and English, I'm not sure if it's a rejection of the other nations in the UK, but certainly the indifference to not just Northern Ireland, but also to Scotland.
Are you saying that there is this kind of real depth of attachment to English nationalism?
Well, it's mixed, because it's whether it's English or British, there's always that kind of uncertainty. But it's possible that it certainly seems to be getting stronger. And of course, some people would suggest that what you need to remedy Brexit and the antagonism that led to it would be precisely to strengthen English nationalism with an English parliament and that sort of thing. But whether that would fly, very doubtful.
There's no appetite for that. I think
no.
that you mentioned some of the other referendums, and there was all these referendums about setting up local governments up in the north, and nobody really wanted them.
No.
I think that English nationalism is a bit of a myth. Occasionally, you have people, kind of waving the flag on certain holidays here and there. But by and large, there is a kind of real estrangement at the moment from the sense of English history, from the sense of Englishness. Insofar as it exists, it's about, sort of drinking beer in a pub, or it's about
a cultural identity.
It is, yeah. But it's a very limited one in terms of affecting people.
But if you look at English history, you can see that it was fully part of European history, and in fact it's utterly impossible to see English history as separate from the history of Europe. They've both been entangled in each other.
But the English attempt to present them as though they were, and so this whole notion that because you're an island, you're therefore not linked to Europe. Ireland is doubly an island and further away from the European mainland than the British Isles, but or than Britain. But doesn't have this kind of peculiar sense of insularity and...
You have to remember that Englishness, historically, was distinguished by the fact that it never advertised its nationalism. Of all the nationalisms in Britain, English nationalism was the most moderate one, the quiet one. And it was fairly confident about itself, to the point at which you didn't have to wave the flag all the time, like in France or in Germany or elsewhere.
Yes, I think governments in general are less trusted now, and representative democracy there's a kind of distrust of it. And in the British case, of course, particularly the behaviour of the Parliament has utterly discredited it, I think. And that, in a sense, makes a second referendum the only obvious solution to this crisis.
One of the things governments are supposed to do is to govern, and it's quite obvious the British government is not governing. So that's immediately a cause of distrust. And whether a second referendum can repair that, I think is very much a question of what the question would be, because one of the disasters of the present is that the question posed in the last referendum was unclear. It was an open-ended question that had many possible answers and outcomes that can't be delivered. So I think if there were to be another referendum, and I think there must be, I can't see any other way out of the present situation, is that the questions posed must be clear, and they can of course be more complicated referendum, like a French-style runoff election where you have more than two questions, but the questions need to be clearly formulated. They also have to correspond to real choices as opposed to something that can't be delivered. And I think that's something that exacerbates discord and distrust, where people are asked to choose something that no government can deliver. So that's not a basis for trust.
Well, initially, I was against the second referendum because I felt, and I still feel that for most people who supported it, did so because they wanted to thwart the result of the first referendum, and they wanted to reverse the whole process. But I think that given what has happened since, and all the confusions that have been sown, particularly by parliamentarians, and the real reluctance by Parliament to give a lead, I do think that a second referendum would be useful because it would legitimate the first one and would make it almost impossible for critics of Brexit to argue that it was the Russians, it was this or that. You know, it would be very, very clear if the second result confirmed what had gone on beforehand. So for that reason, I think it would give a very good opportunity to have a debate, but on potentially on a more sophisticated basis. Having learned the lessons of the past, I think we could move on and have argument that had greater content to it. And therefore, I think that a second referendum would be kind of quite important, as long as one of the choices on it was just to leave, period. Because I don't think that it's a complex question. I think leaving means leaving. And it seems to me that if that was on it and people had an opportunity to weigh up the pros and the cons in relation to that, that would be a positive thing. I think trust will not be regained immediately. I think trust requires a long process of deliberation. And I think the way that trust will eventually emerge is when you have new politicians with new ideas who are prepared to test out their ideas in an open, sort of deliberative way with the population. I think it's only in that context that we can recreate a sense of trust between the people and their representatives.
Yeah, I mean, you used the word deliberation, and that's, I mean, a key dimension of politics. You know, from theories of deliberative democracy. But the problem with referendums is that they close deliberation unless they're inserted into the deliberative process, and then of course they can be quite important instruments.
But don't you think that the very fact that there are a lot of people involved in a referendum and they kind of feel that their role is important, then that makes it possible, unlike in normal elections, for there to be proper deliberations, which can be organized at all kinds of levels?
No, absolutely, if the deliberative process is respected, and that's where a referendum is not necessarily a final outcome. It may generate further questions that will require, amongst other mechanisms, more referendums. So, you know, depending on the questions posed, you know, there could be 3 questions posed, because leave isn't just, you know, one thing, but that's one can imagine immediately today, you know, 3 different possibilities for leave and remain. So, you know, you could have 4 questions, and depending on the choices that people make, then there could be further referendums to reach a point at which there's a majority position, and that might not even be the definitive outcome, because there's also the parliamentary process. So just to take the simple example, I mean, I can't understand why the Prime Minister doesn't put a deal to the country and let the people decide if that's what they want, and then maybe then a case could be made to go with it. I wouldn't like it, but it would be one way to go about it.
But there needs to be a definitive moment, otherwise trust is entirely eroded. People got to know that, you know, their vote has got consequences to it.
Yeah, I accept that while things can be revised, at some point a definitive moment must be reached, but that can't be short-circuited or curtailed, as it were. And, you know, traced back to June 2016, and that's as if that was the decisive moment, and all you're doing is implementing it. Can I comment? I have observed quite a number of different responses from students in quite different contexts, and one very common result is, "Oh, I'm pro-Remain," a student often would say, "but we have to respect the outcome." They somehow seem to have bought into this idea that a decision was made, and that it's now all decided. But aren't we going to leave anyway? And I think what I've noticed is that many students are uninformed about basic everyday politics. However, I have seen some students with extremely well-informed views about Brexit. Predominantly, they're, it seems to me, pro-Europe, pro-Remain, but quite confused by the whole debate.
I think I had a different experience than some of the other people, because I'm probably the only sociology professor who was wholeheartedly behind Brexit. And it was very interesting because, and I wrote an article in the Times Higher about this, because what happened was that, people, when they realized my position, and who shared my position, both members of staff, other lecturers, and students, began to send me emails, and the point that they all made was that we totally agree with you, Frank. What you're saying is absolutely right. But we find it very difficult to express our views because we get shut down. And I almost felt like crying. I got this letter from a young woman lecturer from Wales who said, "Look, I just want to open my mouth and come out as a Brexiteer, but I'm really scared because I still haven't got a contract, I still haven't got a permanent job." And I tried to encourage her by saying, "Look, we don't live in Stalinist Russia or Nazi Germany. If you open your mouth and argue your corner, I'm sure that you will be able to manage what you perceive as a very hostile kind of atmosphere." And I still remember I finished giving a lecture at Kent. It was a debate on feminism. And afterwards, I was kind of grabbed by about 8 students. All of them said, "What do we do? We all think that Brexit is really good. It's really important, but we just find it very difficult to express those kind of sentiments." And I think people don't realize that there is a kind of, it's not anybody's fault. I think there's a kind of sense of self-censoring, and there's a sense of feeling a little bit intimidated by opening your mouth, because basically in higher education, the Remain position is pretty much, kind of totally dominant. And I think that this kind of reaction made me feel really sad, because I'm sure that there might be the opposite reaction, Remainers, feeling uncomfortable in domains where the Brexiteers are kind of quite prevalent. And I made a promise to myself that I would, whatever I did, I would try to create a situation where people from all sides would feel sufficiently relaxed that they could be who they are, and they could feel confident of just because they disagreed, did not constitute a cultural crime. You need to be kind of heard by that particular thing. And I think that's quite an important thing for other people to take on as well, so that regardless of our strongly held views, we do create a space for debate and dialogue, which at the moment still does not exist.
I think I've talked more recently to students from outside the UK in other EU countries and in Hong Kong, and the difficulty was really trying to explain the process to them. They just found it quite bizarre and incomprehensible, and unfortunately I couldn't help them because I find it in many ways incomprehensible as well. There was somebody in Warsaw asked me, I think she was from Belarus, was there any chance of the UK coming back again? And I had to say to her, maybe in your lifetime, but certainly not in mine.
Many students are worried about access to things like the Erasmus program.
I'm spending a lot of time reassuring them that those connections will be reforged no matter what happens.